Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is the Razer Blade 15 Advanced Edition. So this is a premium gaming notebook, and is it worth the money? It features an RTX 2080 Super Max-Q 90 watts, can push up to 95 watts, but is it that much faster? I'll answer this and more. Let's roll. So this notebook features an i7-10875H. That's 8 cores, 12 threads. Features also a astounding 300 hertz display, up to 100% of the sRGB. Also the RTX 2080 Super. And the other component that it has is 16 gigs of memory at 2933, along with a 1 terabyte SSD. So all of those things you can see right under the hood here, quite nice. The one feature that I want to call out on this is actually the vapor chamber. This is something that is supposed to keep it very cool. We know it has a lot of power underneath the hood, and so I'll review a little bit of whether it can. So then on the left-hand side, we have a proprietary power plug able to pull 230 watts, 2 USB 3 ports, a USB-C port capable of doing USB charging up to 65 watts, and a combo headphone mic port. So the keyboard is quite nice. It is a per key RGB, great glass trackpad. It's nice and large. This was really nice to operate on. Has a nice texture on it, so very smooth, glides quite nice. And then it features 2 upright speakers, so firing directly at you, which is nice because most laptops actually have under firing speakers, and so then you get kind of a reverb off of whatever surface you're on. So I found this actually quite nice, and they sound equally as good. Now, not quite as good as, of course, a MacBook Pro. That is definitely the standard right now in the industry. So it still lacks a bit of the depth that you'd find in a MacBook Pro, but overall, very solid. And what's also nice is it's able to do the Chroma app. So, you know, the support for a game, say like Apex Legend, you get a lot of the coloring effects that were made for the game. So moving back to the sound levels, you know, haven't found a laptop that was able to keep the sound levels at almost inaudible levels. Most of my testing, I found this to be in the 45s when it was scaled down in performance to almost virtually nothing, down to the 35 decibel range. We're also at those sound levels getting great performance, so great FPS for those sound levels. And I'll share some graphs with you when I get into some of the gaming benchmarks. So the chassis itself is an all aluminum design and quite a nice premium feel, but the one issue with this design is that you can see it is quite fingerprint prone. You know, just even after the initial unboxing, I was able to run through a couple of the benchmarks, and my wife came down and was like, geez, what happened to the laptop? It's so dirty. And you know, it's just a victim of the design that Razer chose for this model. When we talk about the vapor chamber, you know, it does do its job with keeping everything cool, but one of the side effects that I found about the notebook in general is that the aluminum actually soaks up the heat. And so even with idle, this keyboard it's quite warm even right now. And so I found that, you know, even just browsing the internet and things, it gets pretty warm on your lap, even on the keyboard rest itself. I found that I was getting a little sweaty on my hands all the time, just simply because it's always quite warm. So just something to kind of watch out for. There's several sections across the unit itself that can get up to nearly 50 degrees on the top of the deck as well as under the bottom, which was quite surprising, as I would expect that the vapor chamber would exhaust the heat. But in fact, it kind of retained it throughout the entire body of the chassis. The bottom of the unit itself, this had quite a click to it. Once you notice it's there, it's just quite strange, but it just seems like they needed some more backing behind this. So it gets this audible click when you press on it. Just again, something that they could have improved upon from that perspective. So from a power standpoint, saw this draw about 200 watts from the wall when gaming. So let's talk about the web camera. So it does have a web camera. It does have Windows Hello, which is quite nice. But the web camera, well, that leaves a little bit to be desired. Well, it has a camera. I can't say it's very good. This thing is awful. Look at it. It's grainy. It's slow. I don't understand. A mobile phone can have such a great camera in it, but a laptop that's $4,500 doesn't get any love. It does feature the one hand open, which is nice. It has enough weight on the bottom, so quite nice that it's able to do that. And of course, all the RGB that's on the device can be turned off if you don't want it and you want to be a little bit more discreet while using the device. So the software that Razer bundles with their notebook is called Synapse. This allows you to adjust the performance modes of the device. And so I found a couple settings as I was doing some testing throughout where I found there were some sweet spots, actually game specific. So where you had a lot more high-powered AAA titles were far more demanding. They actually needed all the CPU resources, including the GPU resources, to get the maximum frames per second. So there is a bit of tweaking to get the optimal setting. So something to watch out for on that front. But it has all the settings available for you that's able to. The one comment that I would make though is that I do wish that those settings could be adjusted on the keyboard. The Asus product allows for you to adjust the performance profiles right from the keyboard while gaming. That's a nice feature to have instead of having to Alt-Tab back into the software and adjust the sliders manually. So let's talk about the screen. Great screen, 300 Hz 1080p screen, but the challenge is that in low light conditions or watching this in the dark, it still had your typical IPS glow, which is normal, but the challenge that I saw is that again I had some screen bleed. Screen bleed happening in the lower left-hand corner along with it happening in the lower right-hand corner. Again, once you see it, you can't stop looking at it. So the challenge is I just think for a premium laptop of this scale should have near perfection as it relates to screen bleed. So to me, that's a deal breaker. This could just be a luck of the draw of the one unit that I did get, but something to watch out for if you decide on selecting this notebook. In terms of battery life, running through PC Mark, the PC Mark, I saw about 3 hours and 15 minutes off the battery life. Again, not great, but at the end of the day, it's a gaming notebook. You're going to plug it into the wall. I found that even just watching YouTube or even using it on the couch, you really have to reduce the brightness to maximize the battery life. But so from a weight standpoint, this tipped the scales at 4 pounds 11 ounces based off the config that I had today. So now let's get into the benchmarks. So first up, we have PC Mark 10. I tried it with two settings, both balanced and boost, meaning full CPU and full GPU maxed out. Now the difference for boost was 5667 and the balance was 5441. Now, the one thing that I'll have to note is that at balance, it only came in around 45, 46 decibels, whereas the boosted speed boosted that sound up all the way to 56 decibels. Moving over to Cinebench 20. So I wanted to test out all the different CPU profiles to see how it actually performed. So everything from low, medium, high, boost, and balance, and you can see the results. So what's interesting around this is that the Intel i7-10875H, mouthful, actually features 8-core 16 threads. But it was still outperformed by the i7-10775H with 6 cores, 12 threads. I ran this over and over again expecting a different result, and yet it was not able to dethrone the G17 from Asus. Let's pivot over to Call of Duty Modern Warfare. So 1080p max settings across the board. I went through a number of different profiles, and I did see that the GPU set to high, CPU set to low gave us the best performance along with the lowest sound settings. Later on in the video, I'll actually show what those will actually look like across a number of the games. But you can see this is a 2080 Super at 95 watts, but it's still not able to dethrone a number of the units across the board. In fact, it fell even behind a 2060. Now this is quite the oddity. This particular bench, I went through the chapter 1, the fog of war, and just so I could have a really easy way to duplicate the benchmark over and over again. But this is the result at the end of the day, which was pretty underwhelming considering this is a 2080 Super. Moving over to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again, now I set everything to boosted, and this resulted in a 97, which was the highest score out of the bunch. The one thing that I'd say is it didn't make a huge impact though. We're only talking 2 frames per second. From this perspective, the 2070 Supermax Qs certainly provide far more value for the money. Moving over to 3D Mark. This all set to boosted again. This came in at cresting the 10K mark across Time Spy, and in Firestrike Extreme 8373. Going to Anno 1800, everything set to max settings. This came in at 81 frames per second. Again, this is a very CPU intensive game, and so the benchmark reflects that. Again, the ROG Strix seem to outperform everything in the category still. Moving over to Metro Exodus, full 1080p. This is the full spectrum, everything from extreme all the way down to low. But you can see when you start upping the settings, medium, high, ultra, extreme, this is certainly where the 2080 Super really could shine. And so you can see that across the benches, it was able to really put down a lot more frames across the majority of the devices there. So Death Stranding, one of my new favorite games right now, it came in at 107 frames per second under boosted and 94 frames under balance. Again, there's about a 10 decibel difference between those two settings. So overall, I'd have to say that the balanced mode was more than enough performance for what you're getting. But it's still interesting to see that both the 2070 and the 2070 Super was able to outperform the Razer 15. So Forza Horizon 4 total ultra settings, moving at full boosted. This came at 123 frames per second, again slightly behind the Omens. Moving over to Red Dead Redemption 2. So this is where I wanted to actually break out CPU and GPU temperatures as well as the sound. So this is where I found that GPU set to high along with CPU set to low gave us the best amount of frames for the ultra settings. And so this came in at 6362, which is nice, but the huge benefit here is the temps. GPU only sitting at 68 degrees and the CPU at 78 degrees on average. And the nice thing about all of that is you get only 45 decibels. That makes it quite playable with actually running it through the speakers as opposed to putting headphones on, which was really nice to see. Now moving over to Call of Duty Modern Warfare. So this is where I wanted to showcase across the different profiles. Again, what I found is the best frames per second was actually GPU set to high, CPU set to low, and you can see that the temperatures were well within range, 78 degrees on the CPU temp and GPU only 70 degrees. And that gives you the best frame. So definitely if you're going to use this notebook, you want to tweak with the settings, play with them to see what the optimal frames per second is. Unfortunately, there's no real good way to do that in an automated fashion, but it doesn't take much to just tweak the settings as you go. So final thoughts on the Razer Blade 15 Advanced Edition. Well, if I were to have to sum this up, it is impressive, but underwhelming. And so what I mean by that is there's a number of great features this laptop has, one of which is the sound levels. But the trade-off is how hot it gets on deck as well as beneath the notebook itself. The other issue is that I found that the 2080 Super was underwhelming in performance. In fact, most of the devices that I've reviewed thus far were actually able to outperform this by, in some cases, large amounts of frames, like 20, 30 frames per second. And that, to me, is unacceptable. To me, NVIDIA actually should mandate performance standards for their cards. I suspect that the lower frequency that this needs to operate at to keep it within its thermal profile is just simply too limiting. It's effectively like it's having to be held back just enough so that everything else can cope with all the thermals. But the fact that we had 2070 Supers, Max-Q, same actual power output, able to outperform this is, in my opinion, unacceptable. And I think NVIDIA should have some standards in which they implement to ensure that a 2080 is a 2080 spec. They leave it to, unfortunately, their partners to make those decisions. And so I think as a result, it's very confusing for the consumer. For me, I would expect that 2080 would be faster than anything below that in the model family, 2060s, 2070s, and that's simply not the case. Now, you could say that it's a very thin chassis and it's super quiet. Absolutely, I would agree. But when we're talking about nearly double the price point to get to this level, it doesn't make sense. And to me, that's unreasonable. So what are some of the other issues that I found with this notebook? Well, a small one, I wish that they had performance profiles on the keyboard itself. I think that would be a nice feature to dynamically move between the profiles, as well as set up custom profiles where you could adjust them dynamically. I found that, one game would need a certain type of settings and another game would need a different type of setting. I'd almost like to be able to set profiles based on the game that gives you the optimal power output, but also the right sound levels. The challenge I found is that because you'd have to move the slider on the CPU or the GPU, you couldn't just set everything to max and expect that that would be the best performance. In fact, for what we saw is that when you had everything to the max performance, you'd have to trade off a lot of thermals, peaking out at 90, 75 degrees on the CPU and GPU, whereas you can adjust those settings, get more frames per second as a result. So there is a little bit of finesse that you have to use the device to get the maximum possible performance out of the device. So what else would I say? Well, the chassis gets hot, like really hot. I'm talking nearly 50 degrees on top and on the bottom. While the chassis is a premium all aluminum design, it's a fingerprint magnet. Like, this thing has fingerprints all over it, and I've been relatively careful. And even, running the microfiber over it, it gets right in there. It's very difficult to clean. It'd just be a pain to always have to be on top of your notebook. But, if you end up getting it, just make sure you have, a full cleaning set alongside of it. The other thing is that I think the screen on this, while 300 hertz is amazing, I love the fact that we're nearly 100% of the sRGB. The reality is that you have to bring down all the settings in the game to actually have your games run at that level. Now, even when I ran Apex Legends and Fortnite, I was seeing around 120, 130 frames per second when everything's maxed out in those games. So you could reduce the quality of the game and start to push into the 200s, but who wants to do that? Like, I'm all about max settings, full graphics, get the visual acuity and really enjoy what you're playing. And I'd rather forego frames per second in some cases, but I know not everyone maybe speaks that same language, so you can be the judge, but you can adjust accordingly to your preference. The other feature that this doesn't have is G-Sync. So I didn't really notice any screen tearing, but it would be nice to have some sort of adaptive sync enabled on it, even if it was just G-Sync compatible. So I think that's a miss as well. So would I recommend this unit? I'm going to say it's a no on this. I'm shocked. While the design is premium, it is quality. The sound is quite nice on this, but the challenge is that you're spending so much money for that additional cooling capacity, and arguably all it's done is actually reduce the performance of the 2080 Super just so that it can fit into a thermal envelope. And the reality is that the cost per frame on this is nearly twice as much as something like a 2070 Super that you can get in the Omens. And so what does that mean? I'm going to have to test more. So that is the Razer Blade 15 Advanced Edition. I have to say it is a flop for me. The question is what do you think of this product? Based on the flaws that it had, would you buy it? What product would you like me to review next? Please leave a comment down below. If you like what I'm doing, please like and subscribe to the channel. Please leave a comment. Thank you so much for the subscribers that I have thus far. We've reached over 100 this past week, and so I thank you for all your support. And until next time, bye for now.